Hi, it is Nick Reinhardt Swerk, Director of Social Justice and Young Adult Ministries at Manchester United Methodist Church. This video is the lecture from Race, Religion, and American Identity. We had some Zoom issues when we were meeting on September 8th, 2020. So I'm just recording the kind of lesson content from that video for the folks who are unable to get into the class. So, Race, Religion, and American Identity is a class that is asking, why is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning the most segregated hour in America? A lot of churches, as we've been dealing with race and racism explicitly in our culture, especially, since the 90s, a lot of churches have been asking, how do we become a more diverse church? How do we get more diversity here? And in order to answer that question, we have to fully understand how we've gotten to this place where religion is one of our most segregated kind of areas. My argument for this class is that our religion in the United States is influenced by our larger culture, and then sometimes our religion copies those bad patterns like racism from our culture. But we're also from a country that has a religious history. So our nation's history and culture in itself was crafted by religion, right? So we've got this weird relationship between culture and politics and how we practice our faith in America. So we're going to look at how this system kind of worked out, how we've gotten to the place where we are now, so that as we think about how do we become a more inclusive church environment, we're asking that question with, the education of our history behind us. So this class is mostly going to be lectured format. The way our class works in this framework is a seminar kind of class. So we'll have an opening with a question that we share. Then there will be a lecture component and then an opening for debrief or questions at the end. If you've been at one of my classes at MUMC before, you know that I am very aware and very in love with how well-informed and well-educated our congregation is. So I am kind of just giving you information during the middle section of this class, but my expectation is if you know more about one of the topics that I touched on, to share what you know, or if you have some questions, to ask them. Most of the content of this class is just coming from my experience at seminary. I studied American religious history, especially relating to race. So I'm just kind of giving you a big, broad brush of history from what I learned in graduate school. So this isn't infallible or perfect. So that's why we have this space for our dialogue afterwards. All of our sessions are open. So feel free to invite anyone you want, and we'll include a brief review about what we talked about last time. I'll probably give it a try with this class just to do these lecture videos after the fact and see if that's something that would be helpful to COVID. If you give me your email, if you respond to the email where you got this video, or email me at nikki.reinhardtswerk@ManchesterUMC, I can also get you a copy of our course outlines. I'm going to go ahead and launch into the lecture, so grab yourself something to drink and settle in. First, before we get into the actual kind of history elements that we're going to talk about over the course of this class, we have to start with kind of our foundations. What are we basing this historical and sociological study on? So I am basing a lot of this class on a theologian and academic named Robert Bellah, who came up with the concept of civil religion, right? Bellah was writing right in Vietnam and post-Vietnam era America. He was trying to talk about national identity in the United States and what exactly is this relationship between our religion and our national identity, right? And Bellah claims that our particular history in America has forced us to create our own national identity in order to unify our kind of melting pot population. As the United States was establishing itself as a nation, we didn't have these kind of simple ethnic or shared histories to fall back on as we saw in European countries. So instead, we had to construct an identity, something that makes us us, despite all of the diversity of a country that's made up of immigrant populations, right? So this culture that unifies us, this American culture, is something that Bellah calls a civil religion. This is the religion of America, and it blends Christianity, American history, and other kind of secular cultural events to create a mostly secular identity, which includes all of the aspects of religion like holidays, rituals, holy figures, right? All of these other things that we're used to seeing in religious contexts, right? So our religious identity, our civil religion of America has our kind of patron saints of the founding fathers. And if you go back to look at artwork made right after their deaths, both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, there's all of these paintings that show them, kind of in the position of Christ or an angel, that these figures have this blending of kind of being a historical person and having this larger than life aspect to them. We also have holidays that are a part of our civil religion that we practice as Americans. So, for example, that would be 4th of July, but also Super Bowl Sunday, right? Super Bowl Sunday is like the secular Easter, right, in our civil religion. We also have holy sites that people pilgrimage to for our civil religion, right? Our war memorials and monuments are examples of these holy sites. And I think our disagreement right now about Civil War and Confederate monuments is showing the kind of depth of importance that these holy sites for this civil religion has. In class, this is where we stopped and allowed for other examples of civil religion, but you can probably go on in your head with these ideas of patriotism and American culture. Baseball is a part of our civil religion, as is the Pledge of Allegiance. The American civil religion was kind of at one point conceived of as being Christian, but now has opened up in many ways to be kind of a Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic faith, right? When we talk about God in these kind of secular and political ways, it is often, the Abrahamic God. It's the idea of a creator God or God the Father, and we stay away from the kind of particularities that lead us to spaces of faith. So that is our civil religion, the guiding of our culture with national identity. Another topic that we need to understand in order to kind of move through this class is the idea of American exceptionalism. And that's probably a term you've heard, but in case not, I just wanted to define it really quickly. And American exceptionalism is this idea that we are chosen, or we are a special country with a special duty or responsibility to others. And this is seen in both political and religious realms, right? As Christian missionaries leave the United States to go to other countries to spread the gospel, our government goes out to other countries to spread democracy, right? This is the same kind of, we function as the world's policemen because we think that we are, or we have an idea that we are somehow great and deserving of that role. And that actually comes from this kind of religious perspective at the founding of our country. It's an outgrowth of Christian exceptionalism, this idea that we are to be examples and to go out and to convert the world, which you can argue is a biblical demand, but also this idea of Christian exceptionalism that we are somehow more civil or more informed, more educated by nature, comes from Enlightenment thinking. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about inclusion and identity before we get started. If you've been in one of my classes, you might have heard this part of this lecture before, but when we think of inclusion, when we think of the expanding American identity over time, we can think of it like a banquet, right? Our founding fathers were gathered around a table of our new nation and our new politics. It was white, property-owning men who were at the table, who were able to vote, who were able to lead to things happening. It was heads of households and the things that went with them that were American. As our country develops, that economic tie to property becomes less important, and thus white men of a variety of classes are Americans with their households that come along with them. Again, while we're in this period, we know that African Americans were slaves and considered property, or 3/5 of a person, if you're looking at how we pick out our representation. Over time, this banquet expands, right? Other individuals are brought to the table of fitting in American identity and getting power. Eventually, we add individuals of color. Eventually, we add women. But there's always in this story an us and a them. That's the nature of nations. And so American identity has started small and gone to include more and more people as it moves forward. But this is a project that is not done and that we are still engaged in, right? So we're talking about the increasing inclusion of our national identity in the past so that we can continue to think about this as we move forward. That's our opening. I'm going to go ahead and get into the lecture of history, but if you have any questions or comments about those opening sections, you can always email us or bring it with you next class. So let's get right into our American history and look at kind of colonial times through the Founding Fathers. So the first thing that I want to talk about as we look at this time period is the Pilgrims who came for that first Thanksgiving in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? Those Pilgrims weren't actually Pilgrims. They were English separatists who were seeking freedom from the Church of England. In fact, the group of individuals who ended up coming and starting the colony in Massachusetts Bay escaped England to the Netherlands, were kicked out of the Netherlands, and then engaged in the project of coming to the Americas to start their colony. We kind of have this imagined history that the Pilgrims came here for religious freedom, and it is important to note that they came here for religious freedom for themselves, not religious freedom for all. Those English separatists were Calvinists and wanted to come practice a religion which didn't give the same religious authority to the King of England, right? Calvinism is one of these branches off of Lutheranism, which focuses a little more on our faith away from hierarchical leaders, whereas the Church of England is still following this very kind of political religious combination that we get from the Catholic Church. So what did these English separatists believe? What is the version of Christianity that's at the very start of America? It's a very particular form of Calvinism. Now, Calvinism is a form of Protestant which is really organized around the idea of covenant. We have a covenant with God. So God had the covenant with the people of Israel. God has a covenant with the world because of Jesus. And then we have a covenant with God. Calvinism has this idea that there is the elect. Some of us have been brought into a new covenant with God. We are chosen and we are saved. Individuals can't do anything to determine or change whether or not they are the elect. That is just something that God and God's grace bestows. You can see evidence of someone being the elect because you see evidence of God's love. So in some way, right, great people who do great things are the elect because the fact that they're such a good person is evidence that they are elect, but they aren't elect because they're a good person, right? It's kind of a weird backwards way of thinking of it for some of us. And Calvinism has this really, really strong idea of predestination. There's nothing that you can change about it. You're either elect or you're not. You're either saved or you're damned. When we talk about American prison complex systems, we go back to this idea of Calvinism because our systems of crime and punishment in the United States are kind of based in this theology that there are good people and there are bad people. There are the criminals who are going to do bad things, right? Calvinism doesn't allow a lot of space for redemption because if you're not the elect, then you're predestined to continue on your path of damnation. Calvinism at this time is not a very fun religion, right? We think of the Salem witch trials. Those occurred largely because of the restriction that we have in this Calvinist culture. There's not dancing, there's not singing, there's not wearing of clothing. There's this really strong idea of purity and us having a collective covenant that we all must go in together. So there's this value of the all rather than the individual. So as Massachusetts Bay Colony, the colony is starting up, Jonathan Winthrop is a pastor who is with these colonists. If you've seen the musical Hamilton, Aaron Burr raps that his grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher. That's this Jonathan Winthrop. And right as they get to starting the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he preaches this sermon, City on a Hill. Now, Jonathan Winthrop's most famous sermon is Into the Hands of an Angry God. This is an aggressive fire and brimstone kind of preacher. But as they get to the shores of the new land, he preaches this sermon where he references Matthew 5:14, which is itself a verse that is referencing Isaiah. So he quotes this verse, which says, "You are the light of the world. A city on top of a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Instead, they put it on top of a lampstand, and it shines on all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people, so that they can see good things you do and praise your Father who is in heaven." So Jonathan Winthrop argues that the new land of America, these colonists are being set here as a new promised land to show the rest of the world how to live, both politically and morally. The idea is that we are going to be so upright that we will show godliness, and the whole world will follow suit and fall in line with our particular brand of Calvinist faith. Again, there is a seeking for freedom to practice religion as we want it as a group, not religious freedom for all. In fact, this is the case with most colonies, which when they're first founded are really seen as kind of plantations of religion. Different religious groups got the right to settle in different colonies, right? So our original colonies are kind of separated by religion, and often the religious authority is tied to the political authority, right? So you have the representative from the crown as well as the head of the church who are in charge of disputes or anything like that, and kind of like a judging, as serving as judge and lawyer in the towns. In fact, there are lots of stories of colonists being run from colony to colony looking for religious freedom, especially Unitarians were not accepted at first into a lot of the northeastern colonies that were pushed away. There was a Unitarian woman who was put to death in Massachusetts Bay colony because she was kicked out for not being Calvinist and came back in town, right? So the colonies are divided by religion and have ties between religious and political authorities. So once the founding fathers come along and are thinking of a new nation and setting up new governments, this is something that there is concern about, right? In colonial America, for example, in the kind of Kentucky and Tennessee regions, there were Catholic individuals who had come from Ireland and Scotland, but it was illegal in those territories for priests to practice weddings, right? So there were incidences of people being thrown into jail for practicing weddings. And so the founding fathers are concerned about what's going on. They're concerned about the right of the Anabaptists to be able to preach without getting arrested. They're concerned about how we're going to relate to church institutions when our example of the Church of England wasn't what we want to continue doing. And this is what's in the minds of especially Thomas Jefferson and James Madison as they are writing the Federalist Papers and starting to think through the thoughts that get us to our establishment of our first the word is escaping me, our first thing on the Bill of Rights. So we have our rights that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there's two parts of this one. The first one is the establishment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This states that we are not a Christian country officially. We are a country with Christians in it. Again, at this time, there is not a respect for religious diversity outside of different kinds of forms of Protestantism and sometimes allowing for Catholicism. So Congress shall not make a law respecting the establishment of religion, so states are not allowed to pick an official religion, right? That stays out of the purview of the state. This allows individuals to be able to practice their own religion and not be coerced into anything because of the state, or not be forced into funding the church because of taxes towards the state. And then the free exercise clause, that we shall make no laws prohibiting the free exercise of religion, that if your practicing of your religion doesn't bump into anyone else's rights, then you have the freedom to determine your own religious perspectives. The men who were coming up with these concepts were not having the idea that, there's a bunch of different religions going on, or you can be religious or not be religious. Rather, there's a concern that we cannot legislate what happens in someone's conscience. The founding fathers write about the importance of giving people the freedom to explore and find God in their own context. There's still an understanding, an assumption that people will be religious and participate in their religious systems. It's just how that's relating to government that's changing. So that's just kind of our really quick view at the founding of our country and how this religion and culture interacted. But let's start talking about how that interacted with race. So now we're going to talk about kind of the Revolutionary War period through antebellum America. And I want to talk a little bit about race and slavery and the relationship between those two things, right? Because some folks will point to the early days of the colonies and the Americas and say, you know, we had Irish slaves or Scottish slaves, so you know, there were white slaves. And that's not entirely true, right? Slavery in the United States, chattel slavery, which continues through generations, which sees slaves as animalistic and non-human, is fundamentally different from the indentured servitude that was experienced by Irish and Scottish immigrants or prisoners of war, right? Slaves were kidnapped from Africa and brought through the slave trade, going often to the Caribbean and then to the United States or to Europe. Slaves were often divided from their families and tribal groups so that their language and religious ties would be lost. Families were divided at slave markets. This makes for better labor by having those individuals, but of course it's devastating to the individuals who go through these systems. This is different than the indentured servitude, in which folks who wanted to immigrate and couldn't afford it, or folks who had been committed of a crime, had an amount that they were working off in labor. So you did your time to work off your debt, and then you were free. Whole families would sell themselves into indentured servitude, so your children might be a servant along with you, but through however many years or perhaps even a lifetime, you work yourself free of that bondage, and that bondage does not transfer from parent to child, right? So it's two kind of different forms of servitude that we have happening, and chattel slavery is itself different. So Africans who were brought as slaves were seen as a non-human labor force. Communities were disconnected and forced to lose their language, religion, and culture. So while individuals will hold, small things themselves, we lose this kind of community wealth of knowledge, and thus African cultures are broken into smaller pieces, and Africans who are slaves and then their children create new kind of cultures in slave communities that are different but still related to those African cultures that they came from. So conflicts with Christianity create a paternalistic, civilizing view where African slaves and their descendants can be saved by Christianity, right? So we have the slave trade where we have these people who are not human who are working for us, but how does this go together with our gospel? Well, okay, it goes with our gospel because the Old Testament says slavery is okay, but also we are helping these people. I'm like a parent. I'm civilizing them and bringing them Christianity. Thus, they will do their service now and be saved so that they can be free in the afterlife. So we get two kind of really terrible views of slavery, but one seems nicer. One, we are using these people for our economic gain versus we are utilizing the workforce and trying to save or help them. So this urge to civilize and save slaves leads to formations of different forms of slave religion where people in bondage are practicing different religions. So let's go through what some of those examples were. So some larger plantations actually built churches for their slaves, and itinerant preachers would share gospel messages that encouraged compliance with systems of slavery. Now, of course, slaves were not allowed to read or write, so this was you sit here, I tell you the scripture, and I tell you what it means. The theology that builds up around this focuses almost entirely on personal piety, the importance of work, and the promise that obedience brings reward in the afterlife. So you are a good Christian by being a good slave. Your pain and work now is going to be rewarded in the good by and by when you get to go to heaven. This is something that we see still in a lot of places. This religion that focuses on personal piety. It's often used by larger institutions to kind of keep people from asking questions or engaging too much in the world around them. It is a self-focused religion that keeps you following the rules. So that's one option. The second one, and this is also what was happening in the North with free blacks, is some slaves in usually smaller plantations and free blacks attended white worship services, but had to sit in balconies away or separated from the white population. They weren't necessarily being preached to, but they were there while this is happening. Of course, in some of these situations, there are also sermons that are supporting systems of slavery. In the North, you'll find some abolitionist churches that are preaching against that, but it is definitely not the norm. And then we also have the individuals who practice their own forms of religion outside of white culture. So some individuals who in slavery held clandestine worship meetings that were called brush harbor meetings. These were often done down by creeks or in the brush at night, hidden from the overseer and the masters. So these particular meetings blend Christianity with African traditions and perspectives and music. We now call this particular blend of African and Christian traditions Yoruba. So this is a situation in which kind of the scriptures and theology of Christianity become the vehicle for some of these other traditions. And this form of religion is one that is often based on group identity and freedom. Finally, we also know that slave religion was practiced in the fields with spirituals. Most spirituals sing of the afterlife, focus on Moses and escape from Israel and God as redeemer. From the very beginning of American slavery, black individuals in the U.S. grabbed onto this idea of Moses and identified with the Israelites who needed to be freed from their slavery from Pharaoh. And this is something that we see a lot in these Brush Harbor and these spirituals. This focus on God is with us in our suffering now and in the afterlife. So that's kind of this distinction that we start to get even now between black Christianity and white Christianity, is a focus on spirituality, a focus on piety versus a focus on God with us in our suffering and God as a liberating force. Let's talk a little bit more about what was happening in those northern free states. So initially in the North, black individuals are attending these white churches, and then this leads to the creation of African societies, which would be the black individuals who are at a particular church who start to have classes amongst themselves or begin to offer services and community care for one another. Already in the 1780s, black ministers start preaching to their own communities in these kinds of African societies. And in 1816 is the first time that we get an all-black congregation. So 4 black congregations in the Mid-Atlantic region come together to create the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It is the first independent denomination which is fully black and allows for black leadership over black congregations in an official sense, right? There's a difference in that 1780s of preaching to our own community versus 1860 when we have the authority of a denomination behind us. It's important to note Methodist is in there, right? Black folks had to leave the Methodist Church, which would not let them preach and would not let them become a part of our systems. That's why there is an AME and CME church, which are black Methodist denominations that continue to exist till today. This is not the first time that black individuals left the Methodist Church because we were failing to be inclusive. There are examples that go all through history. But when we ask why is United Methodism so white, one reason is because all the way back in 1800s, black individuals had to create their own denomination in order to have their own churches. So this brings us to the 1800s, and there's a couple more things we need to talk about before we get to the Civil War, which is where we're picking up with next week. So one thing I want to talk about is during the early 1800s is kind of the heyday of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is the idea that God put us here and gave us this land, and it is ours, and we should go all the way to the ocean. And there's kind of 3 basic understandings at the bottom of manifest destiny that are theological claims. So the first one is there is virtue of American people and their institutions. Our institutions are inherently good and godly. Second, we have a mission to spread these institutions thereby redeeming and remaking the world in the image of the United States. That mission comes from God, but the image that we are remaking in is the United States, not in the image of God, right? We can see that Robert Bella's argument that civil religion started to become secular and moving away from faith while being based on faith is starting to happen here, where God calls us to remake the world, not in God's image, but in our own. Because the third claim is this is our destiny under God to do this work. This is how we are this city on a hill. An example is by taking land, pushing people off of it, taking over. Manifest destiny impulses included the Trail of Tears, the moving of Native individuals to reservations, the kidnapping of Native children, and educating them in Western schools. This is also when we start to see missionary activities doing similar things like this in other parts of the world, where we go in and offer things from our institutions like health, but make it dependent on also speaking English and picking up all of these other kind of civilizing things. So this is this civilizing impulse, which we see in missionary activities, is something that goes all the way back to that exceptionalism in Enlightenment, that because we have superior technology, we have superior virtue, we are going to come in and tell you how to do everything because that's what we are meant to do here. So this is problematic, of course, because of the devastation that it brings to the Native communities, but it's not just slaves and Native Americans that are the other that the American identity must take over, kill, or fix. We also have very, very active anti-Catholic and anti-Mormon sentiments. If you go back and look at the history in the 1800s, there are tons of documents going from individual to individual, from committees to Congress, with concern about what do we do to ensure Catholics aren't a part of this westward movement? How do we ensure that Catholics aren't going and settling land in the West? Because Catholics, they're not really American. They are papists. They aren't us. They're a them. They are more connected and more loyal to the Pope than to us. They are a threat. They are other. We should be getting them to leave. Does this sound familiar yet? Right? Because at this point in our American history, even up to World War I, Catholics aren't really considered us. They're someone else. And then, of course, during this time, we also have the rise of Mormonism. You might not know this, but Mormons believe that the Garden of Eden was in Missouri, in Jackson County, which is over by Kansas City, I think. So those Mormons came from New York, settled in Illinois, visited the Holy Lands in Missouri, but ultimately left to go to Utah after being violently run out of town. In fact, in St. Louis, it's one of those laws we never got rid of that you can't actually act on. It's legal to shoot a Mormon for being on your property as long as you do not kill them. Joseph Smith was shot through a window, and it was legal in order to get the Mormons to go away to where they ultimately settled in Utah, which was unclaimed territory at the time. There was a concern that they are not the Protestant version of religion, so thus they are not truly Americans. Of course, also, if you're familiar with history, you know that there is extreme anti-Asian sentiment during this point in history. While there is large immigration of individuals, especially from China, to the West Coast, we begin to have the American railway system going up, dependent on this Asian labor, but it's also dependent upon Asian labor, which is in no way protected or valued, right? We know that the history of the creation of the American Railroad involves many, many hundreds of individuals who were killed because there were no worker protections. And those individuals who worked on the railroad were in no way American at any point. That's why we have these kind of phenomenon of Chinatowns, of people staying in these communities, because those Chinatowns were created for the Asian immigrants who were coming to work but were not able to become a part of our society. In fact, when we finally allow Asian Americans to become citizens, it is because of a Supreme Court case which argues Asians are not black and thus don't fall under the laws that prevent black and Native peoples from being American. So we only start to include Asian Americans into American identity after a Supreme Court case that argues Asian people are close enough to being white that they should count as American. Again, is any of this feeling a little uncomfortably familiar? So that's what's going on in our lands out west. But what about what's happening in our cities? Right, in the 1800s to the 1850s, our cities are also growing more and more diverse, because we're getting these waves of immigration. So European migration starts bringing more diversity to our shores, and of course, these individuals kind of tend to immigrate into the United States and settle in larger cities before moving west. So in our cities, we start to have these populations of immigrants from countries we didn't have from before, like Italy, like Ireland, like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, right? It's starting to get more towards the east and north. And these immigrants are seen as un-American because they're understood as being somehow foundationally different than the British and German and French immigrants who had been here to this point. These communities are seen as un-American because they are loud. They are lazy. Their loyalties are mixed. Maybe they're loyal to their home country or to the Pope. They're seen as overly sexual, out of control, having too many children. Again, we know what the characterization of the other is like because it's the same characterizations today, just different people who are being seen that way. So if you watch shows like Peaky Blinders or movies like Gangs of New York, you can see this dynamic where we have immigrant communities in tenements, and those individuals as seen as being other and not a part of American culture. They are not part of our civilized culture. They are a problem. They are something else. This isolation of these religious others and national others into communities ultimately leads to the need for Catholic community services. So if you've ever wondered, why is it that we have this stereotype of Irish Catholic police officers or Irish Catholic fire departments, it is because a lot of these police departments and fire departments in cities were set up by Catholic communities because the systems that protected the city would not protect them. Before we had official fire departments, it was volunteer firefighters who would help their neighbors, but Protestant firefighters might not go to the tenements to help their neighbors. So then we have to create these community services, and those community services are things that we see continuing to today. This includes Catholic education, right? So Catholic communities, which Catholics are not welcome into the public schools, which are teaching Protestant religion at the time, start to create their own Catholic schools, which is why we get the parochial school system. As we move forward into the 20s and start to have arguments around evolution and the role of religion and education, that existing system of Catholic schools is what leads to Catholic schools becoming the kind of prestigious private schools as we move forward. That's kind of a larger conversation that we can have as we talk about cultural divides. But what's important to note is this identity doesn't include these Europeans until these Europeans, after a few generations, start to adopt the kind of mainstream culture and fit in with that civil religion of America. So I'm about at 40 minutes, which is what we aim for these lectures. So this is where we're going to stop our kind of sweep over our first section of history. Next week, on the 15th, we are going to talk about debates over slavery, getting into the Civil War, going through to World War II. And then in our third and final class, we'll talk about kind of World War II through contemporary things that are happening for today. I normally in classes is where we would stop for questions and conversation. So once again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me or share them with us next time we gather. I am praying for you, and I look forward to seeing you either online or in person soon. Bye.